over and start doing it right now. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Quarantine Collective's ongoing reading of Anti-Oedipus. We're close to hitting a milestone. We're about a month out from our 5-year anniversary of the first reading, which is messes with me every time I say it, because it fucks with my head that we've been doing this for 5 fucking years. That I've been doing this for 5 years. I've birthed a new person. I've created an entire new person in that time, and yet somehow I am still learning about this book. I was able to create life, yet this. But I want to thank you for joining. We are going to be stepping into where we left off last week. Just a few little notes to sort of clean up sort of secretarial stuff. As we are getting close to the end of that 5 years, I'm collecting, little mini essays or art from various people who've been here for the whole time. And if you haven't, that's fine too, collecting from you as well. Sort of what the QC is meant to you. We're playing in a weird space, and we've been playing in a weird space of this sort of extra academic thing, trying to figure out how to do, proper pedagogy, but without it being academic. Playing in a different space than normal. And so it's been a journey. So we're collecting essays on that, and that's going to be fun to sort of put those together, hoping to maybe print something. Yeah, we'll get out some copies at minimum. It'll be really fun to read those out. And then the second thing is a little thing I've added to our stream today. So I'll switch over to the reading. You can see that I added, 1 second. Where'd it go? Did it disappear? It did disappear. 1 second. There it is. You'll see this number on my shoulder. I'm just going to leave it there. We're talking about capitalism today, and we're going to continue to be talking about capitalism, and there's very few things that are as interesting in capitalism as the stock market. Is it acceptable to talk about how DGQC lets me shitpost in a very particular way? You are free to do as you do. Like, that's the whole point of the essays, is like what the space is meant to you. The number right here is Tesla's stock price, because it's really fascinating as things happen, as the world responds. It's important to remember, as my video that went out this overnight, and you can go check out, capitalism is about efficiency. And the marketplace doesn't care about a lot of stuff. So as Tesla loses 9 to 10% of its market share today, this is a under 300 watch. It's already happened once. People are waiting for a second time because the shorts have already begun. This is down from $450 at the high this last year, which is a loss somewhere around $500 billion, I think. Some silly, stupid number. We're in that phase of capitalism where every time something big happens, it's always the largest loss of value that's ever happened, which I appreciate when that happens. It's good for us to remember when these things go. So today, we are continuing from where we left off last week. Where we left off is I had us on 302, bottom of 302, if you'd like to follow along. As you can see here, here. I need to get used to pointing to things. Here. We asked what illegal shit he'll do to recover that. I think it's going to be really fascinating to watch, because it is a lot of people don't understand how wealth works, but it's important to remember Elon doesn't have money. Not like you and I get a paycheck, or YouTube sends me the $3 I make off the stream ever. The reality is that he takes his stock value, and then he takes out loans against his stock based on future stock value. And so when that number goes down, it's not just him losing money. That's how a lot of people see it. But it's him losing collateral, and monumental levels of collateral. A 10% loss is astonishing. And it puts not just him, but all the banks who loaned him money in a really shitty place. And it makes people not want to loan him money again. it becomes this sort of a self-fulfilling nightmare system. I'm always fascinated by it. And we're going to kind of be talking about some of that stuff. So just keep an eye. You'll see it gets really close to under 300, and then people bump it back up. It's really fun to watch. But we'll just kind of keep that there, and we are going to continue. Where we've been talking is about desire and labor. We're talking about libidinal activity, desiring production and labor production within the realm of how psychoanalysis, or what we would call mental health, or self-help, or self-care, or counseling, or discipline, you might say, how these things come in personally on people, how they interact personally. One of the things I've gone a little bit nuts on over the last couple of weeks has been how people have talked about self-help, specifically Philosophy Tube, who's generally garbage, but also, the Jordan Petersons of everything, and how both of them talk about self-help as though it can help people. This section of this book, and most of Anti-Oedipus, is really focused on getting us away from this idea of what self-help usually means, because it tends to mean disciplining. And so as we talk through this, as we talk through how social repression, psychic repression, desire, and the flux within capital work, keep in mind these sort of ideas, because we're going to be pushing around. So let's get to it. Obviously, this does not mean that the capitalist being, or the being in capitalism, desires to work, or that he works according to his desire. But the identity of desire and labor is not a myth. It is rather the active utopia par excellence that designates the capitalist limit to be overcome through desiring production. We're going to go over all this, don't worry. But why precisely is desiring production situated at the always counteracted limit of capitalism? Why, at the same time as it discovers the subjective essence of desire and labor, a common essence in so much as it is the activity of production in general, is capitalism continually re-alienating this essence, and without interruption, in a repressive machine that divides the essence in two and maintains it divided? Abstract labor on the one hand, abstract desire, we finished the line, abstract desire on the other. Political economy and psychoanalysis, political economy and libidinal economy. Here, we are able to appreciate the full extent to which psychoanalysis belongs to capitalism. For as we have seen, capitalism indeed has as its limit the decoded flux of desiring production, but it never stops repelling them by binding them in an axiomatic that takes the place of codes. Capitalism is inseparable from the movement of deterritorialization, but this movement is exorcised through factitious and artificial reterritorializations. Capitalism is constructed on the ruins of the territorial and the despotic, the mythic and the tragic, but it reestablishes them in its own service and in another form as images of capital. All right, we are going to move our way down to the end of this line. I always like finishing a line in this book. It feels good. It's a big moment. All right, so this previous section we were talking about, generally speaking, just to read sort of at the end, desiring machines are in social machines and nowhere else, so that the conjunction of decoded flux in the capitalist machine liberates free figures of the universal subjective libido. In short, the discovery of an activity of production in general without distinction, as it appears in capitalism, is the identical discovery of both political economy and psychoanalysis beyond determinate systems of representation. They're talking about as we sort of break down and we find what is actually happening inside of capital, we tend to find these things together. We find political economy and psychoanalysis tied in together. Psychoanalysis is a larger catch-all term than you may want to put in there in the first place. Psychiatry would be a thing. The nature of saying that there is mental conditions that are determinate, that there are structures that are determinate of the human mind, these kinds of things get placed in there. They open. Obviously, this does not mean the capitalist being, or the being in capitalism, desires to work, or that he works according to his desire. Really base. It is not that people within capitalism, anyone, desires to work, or that they work according to desire. Don't think that desire is at that point in line. That's post-personal. Oh, well, they work because their desire puts them there, or they desire to work. This is how capitalism reforms people. It does this, but this is how No. That's not what is happening here. That's the point. It isn't that they're claiming that people in capitalist systems naturally want to work, or that work fulfills a desire. This is not what they're saying as a thing. The second bit that they have here, but the identity of desire and labor is not a myth. It is rather the active utopia par excellence that designates the capitalist limit to be overcome through desiring production. So when we talk about labor and we talk about desire as sort of being unified, or that they are, one is sort of the other half of one. Remember, labor being sort of the abstracted relationship of man to production, desire machines and production is desire, and how they're molar and molecular, two halves sort of like different regimes. It's not mythic, they're saying. It's not like some mythic sort of delirium that sits up this long story that they're trying to put in abstract space, but instead that there is this, it is the active utopia par excellence. The thing we can utilize to transcend capital. It is an active utopia par excellence, designating a capitalist limit to be overcome through desiring production. It's a boundary of capitalism that we're able to find a way to overcome with desire as a productive force, if we want to consider that. It's kind of how they're breaking this up. There's a reason I'm going sentence by sentence. This shit's dense. Misha, I've listened to Malibu's objection to deleuze. She raises the concept of self-affection as a lot of her problem. Self-affection connects to the idea of self-help somehow. I would have to go, Malibu's wonderful. I would have to go give her a lot more time on exactly what she means by that, because she is very particular with how she uses her language. And I would not want to analogize where it's not appropriate for her. But I've got a few of her books. I have to go back and reread. Sorry. But why precisely is desiring production situated at this limit, this counteracted limit of capital? Because it's this thing, desire being placed there. Capitalism never sort of incorporates it, not fully. It's always placed at that edge. Why, at the same time as it discovers this subjective essence of desire and labor? In as much in this next bit, this is about sort of, how do I put this? This is such a complex fucking sentence. They're talking about this oddness of how capitalism operates. I went through this in my video a bit that I released today. But the big function that they're sort of aiming at is to be talking about this odd way that capitalism, while discovering the essence of desire and labor, breaking it apart, decoding and all of that, it ultimately also alienates it in a repressive machine, dividing it in two, labor and desire. Labor being the sort of idea, the idealized sort of sublimated idea that desire is dangerous, but labor is useful. Abstract labor on one hand, abstract desire on another. Why do we split them? Why do we have this division? And why do we play with this thing? This is if you want to read more on like this concept, there's Leotard does a lot on this. Klosowski, hugely a ton on this, to put it very lightly. Very, very lightly. Klosowski puts an incredible amount of effort into those very concepts. But for them, this division and these questions, with this, we are able to appreciate the extent to which psychoanalysis or, again, psychoanalytic theory, the idea of psychiatry, these other things, belong to capitalism. Because capitalism has, at the limit, the decoded flux, but it does not stop repelling them, because it binds them in an axiomatic that takes the place of codes. This is, again, returning to chapter 3, where they talk about the switch from overcoding from coding to overcoding under the despot, and then under the despot to capital, the switch from overcoding to decoding to axiomatizing. This thing that happens, this deterritorialization that happens, capitalism is the element. You can't break these things apart. The movement is exercised through factitious and artificial reterritorializations. Capitalism comes back in, throws these things back into throws these reterritorializations back into play. Even though it's deterritorializing, it creates artificial territories, artificial boundaries, artificial axiomatized rules that reinforce that same power structure, that reinforce those same dynamics, despite the codes now being no longer something that's actively practiced, no longer something that's actively moving, not in the sort of structural anthropologist sense, the way that we talk about it with, again, uncontacted tribes or even overcoding with kings and everyone else. Capitalism breaks those codes down entirely. It deterritorializes, decodes, but you can't have the D without the re, as I used to say, and I still do with this book, because I hate saying deterritorialization, reterritorialization over and over and over. But you can't have the D without the re. So you reterritorialize, but it's reestablished in another form. These images of capital, these axiomatized power structures that are set up in a very, very particular way. This serves the functions of capital, power, and other things very particularly and very specifically. They're no longer, again, the old codes. As they say here, that capitalism is constructed on the ruins of the territorial and the despotic, the mythic and the tragic representations. These things, I gave examples. My video obviously coincided with our reading for a very particular reason. But when we talk about the Dogon, which they will talk about again, and which we've talked about already in this, because that's Grial spent a huge amount of time with the Dogon tribe. The way that they ended up finding their mythology and their labor and their sacred realities that they found, these aren't like three things that sort of danced around each other. It tends to be how we think of like Christianity and religions today, Judaism, all of these things are like a religion. And then you also have your trade, and then you also have, and you kind of have things that cross over. But that's not really how codes formed once upon a time. Codes formed through active behaviors, and those behaviors that were repeated found a way to either be useful, to be valued, or to be sacralized. The Dogon blacksmiths, as an example, they're very, very good blacksmiths, but they weren't blacksmiths just because they could hammer good. It was the entirety of the thing was them reenacting the creation myth of the Dogon. That every strike was doing this, every movement was doing this. Every time they would douse something in water or they would overheat it, they were reliving the creation myths. These things were tied together. And of course, because all of this was valued in the tribe, those who controlled value were the ones who were able to do this, who were bred to do this, who were trained to do this. Men. This setup was something that was, I would say, developed in codes much more close to where desire is able to be consumed directly. And that's what they talk about inside of the territorial machine. Tribes do things, and it's about survival, it's about stability, and they kind of just keep moving. People are born into a history. They're born into a social space. And those codes, they then develop, and they mutate slightly. They're not exactly copied. It's not a perfect replication. But as they change, just little by little through time, through generations, these codes become, ongoing. They morph with power. They morph with what's happening around them. They're built into the world. They're constantly shifting. They're dynamic. Capital doesn't really work like that. Capital's got axiomatizations. It takes the things that were codes before, breaks them down to their smallest bits so we can turn them into efficiencies in labor, and so capital can use it for control and power, right? This thing that capital does, it doesn't leave alone any of this. So here I am, and I believe I have social codes. We like to talk about such things. We talk about what it means for us to have, what is a man, what is a woman, Matt Walsh bullshit, all of that stuff. We act like we have codes, but the codes don't work the way that they used to. They're not like lived experiences in that way. Instead, They're sort of given to us by society. They're axiomatized through capital and through value. And that efficiency that we find inside of capital makes this work in a very particularly directed way. So we have the axiomatizations, not really the codes. We use the old codes, the structure of them and the setup of them, but it's really their charred remains. It's the way I like to talk about it is like the sand castles or coral reefs once upon a time that there's no life in anymore, but we still keep them around. But it's the axiomatizations that do that. If that makes a little bit of sense. It's tough.
Form without content. A form without content. To use the Hegelian...
Well, it's to use the Helmslevian sense too, because it's particularly what's happening in capital is we have value form, but there's no content and there's no expression. It's just purely the form element of value. And this becomes deeply fungible. Again, this is what capital is. Capital is the breakdown of things to purely that element. The way that we're watching Tesla stock here bounce around, that money is also coffee. That money, I mean, coffee futures, but coffee, that value that's able to be seen here as Tesla stock going up and down, it's not just Tesla stock, that's value. And it's in American dollars, but it's fungible entirely. And like that idea that everything has its price, blah, 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 that capitalism puts a value on everything. Yes. And that value that is fungible, that separates, that pushes through all of this stuff, this is kind of the big deal. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? I am not going to read chat. It seems there's arguments. It's wonderful. What a wonderful, fun place chat is. But generally speaking, this is what they're getting at. That capitalism ultimately comes from this collapse of the earlier systems, this territorial or the despotic, and their cultural forms, the codes and structures that were formed inside of them. But it repurposes those forms, just the forms, to serve its own functions. It rebuilds them inside of these axiomatics. It's not the same as the codes, which sort of are immediately lived and sort of change and shift based on what's really happening. The axiomatics are global, fungible. It changes a lot of shit, sort of how we deal with that, generally speaking. But this is more so we can lead into and talk about our favorite guy, the Marx, because they actually have a really fantastic sort of summary of how Marx fits in with this. JK, go for it.
Yeah, would you say that the people now, like the MAGA, are the people who are or have a desire to go back to the codes, and kind of like they're not able to adapt to the axiomatization of everything, but they're kind of trying to
they're more invested in those structures. They're more invested in them, but not by wide margins. Again, it's not so much that people who are MAGA want to go back to those codes, is that they're invested, their desire machines. Their desire is invested in those structures. But the same is very true of the liberals. It's one of the things, and this is global. That's why they're like, when we talk about, Americans, it's like, yeah, but I've been elsewhere. Like, the idea of weirdos we don't want is not an American thing. So when we talk about, going back to the codes of man or woman, in Europe, they're very happy to have trans people as long as you're passing, and they kind of go a little bit, the not passing thing is kind of a big fucking deal these days, kind of everywhere. The functions and the way we're invested in these things, they'll rear their heads in a lot of ways. Again, we have a lot of symptoms, but it's not so much saying, the symptom is the cause. Instead, it's understanding where the sickness actually lies, how the sickness operates. It's Nietzschean almost in that sense. So when we talk about MAGA being more invested, yes, but the liberal order is also wanting to go back or utilize these very same codes. I talk in my video about how overall in America, I'll just talk about America, it's easy this way. I think this is also true throughout Europe. Education is no longer seen as like a human right or a thing that we necessarily are going to give to all people so they can achieve and self-actualize. That's like the fantasy of the liberal ideal that no one really ascribes to anymore. Instead, very much people talk about education that will help them derive better salaries, will help them work better, will prepare them for a life in the workforce. And so you have a really weird sort of turn where MAGA people may overcorrect and want to get rid of X, Y, and Z, or push, pure STEM and get rid of art. But you also have liberals who happily will say, well, yeah, but we can also have those artists serve capital. And it's like, that's kind of saying the same thing, just kind of nicer. Just kind of nicer, I guess, would be the phrasing of it, if that makes sense. One sec. I did get a question apparently in chat. God damn it. I can't read anything. What is with me today? Is deterritorialization a subclass of decoding? So it's important to talk about sort of all of the aspects of these things and not to think of them as subclasses or class par excellence or whatever it may be. They're using different words for different parts of things. Coding, decoding, recoding, overcoding, these things are very particular to structural anthropology as per Claude Levi-Strauss or Godelier and a lot of other people in that work. When we talk about social codes, the way we find value or how we come to have meaning socially between people, right? Territorialization is different. It's how we break things up into the world. It's how we separate and we break things down. The term comes from anthropology, the idea of the territoriality of a people. Think of an uncontacted tribe on an island. They've never gone off the island. As far as they know, it's the world is the island. And that's kind of where they stop. Beyond this, the ability for them to go, or a bunch of guys show up in ships, say Spanish conquistadors, they land. This moment changes them because now they know their island is not the world. They get deterritorialized, but it's deterritorialization that happens at the same time as re-territorialization. This is the worst thing to type on a mobile phone that exists, by the way. So these two things happen pretty much back to back, or at the same time, effectively. There's not like a gap between them. There's not stuff that happens between them. It's in the moment that you go, holy fuck, there's more to the world. You go, holy fuck, there's more to the world. And that re-territorialization that separates out and goes, oh, this is where things are. This is the edges of stuff. Here's where things go. Here's how things are divided up. It's different than coding, and it's a way of viewing everything. It's a way of viewing contextuality, you could say, whereas coding is a way of finding meaning. These are important because as we get through this book, and if you decide to move on to 1,000 Plateaus, or really a lot of Deleuze's other writings and works, Deleuze really enjoys utilizing the topological wording through all these and really talking about how these things sort of form strata or how territorialities work together. Like there's all of this language that's very much around land for a reason. And a lot of this comes out of that. So they're different, but they're worth playing with and understanding as you go. Right? I hope that makes sense. Codes are not part of territories. That's the thing. It's different setups and different ways that we sort of function as things sort of meaning sort of collapses together. Again, think that meaning doesn't exist prior to you making sense of things. Literally making sense. This is why we use the term. This is why Deleuze uses the term. The logic of sense, the logic of making sense is we divine meaning out of all of this stuff that's coming towards us as we sort of sew it together and then we spit it back out. That setup of everything that's coming at us that causes and builds this sort of thing, all of this together. Territoriality versus codes are two different parts of the anthropological sort of structures that are playing with these things. Does that make sense? Because I know we also have people now like this is not an easy one to sort of go over. Does that generally flow as a thing? Like, territoriality is literally territories, organization of space, the hierarchicalization of spaces and functions, and the definition of those things. Who belongs to what land belongs to who belongs to what lands. Nation states would be part of this, but so would caste systems, classes, social hierarchies in general. This becomes deterritorialized. You destabilize these structures. This is a release of desire from a fixity, from being determined to land somewhere. If your territoriality is that your territorialization is sort of old, and we'll talk about old tribes. I talk about the Inca. I spent too much time reading about the Inca for some reason the last couple weeks. The way land works is not so much that you are like given a parcel of land. Your territory is not that piece of land. Instead, there's land that you are responsible for. It's hard to talk about in our language because it is not ownership as we know it. If I have land, I'm a renter right now. I'm renting. I have a piece of paper that says I'm renting from someone who has a piece of paper that says they own it, from someone who has a piece of paper that says they sold it to them, from someone that has a piece of paper from the government that says it's a piece of land. That's how I have it. That's the territorialization that exists in capital. That's not how it worked pre-writing, obviously, right? Like pre-writing, that's not a fucking thing. That's not how any of that works. What's up, JK?
So, with the, we're at a point where we are, from capitalism, we're going from capitalism. Well, we begin with the despotic to capitalism, and then capitalism is leading us to another kind of a despotic regime, right?
No.
Isn't Trump a representative of a kind of a despotic?
No.
And it's
let's do a speed run. We're gonna speed run through chapter 3 because I think it's probably pretty necessary to just straight speed run through chapter 3. Hey, there's a bunch. I'm going way back in time, 10,000, 20,000 years. Groups of people begin forming. Hey, you meet someone, you fuck someone, you have another person. That person also exists. And then you meet other people, and the person you had fucks someone else, and then they have another person. And you're kind of like, oh, well, fuck, we have people in common. Let's hang out. So you guys hang out. You form a tribe. You form this sort of unit. But you don't exist in 10 generations. You are dead. You're dead pretty much as soon as your grandkids are alive. Like, this, not a fun time. And you're having lots of kids and lots of grandkids. And lots of people get together and, hey, they're starting to figure out, oh, we can do this, I can do this. And people just kind of try to do what they do. After generations, they start going, well, wait, I noticed that when we do this, this happens. Oh, well, we should do that again. Okay, cool. Oh, we burn these plants. And that stuff that we use, some of it blew on some meat. It made it so the meat actually stayed fresh longer. What we would call cured it. Holy shit, you cured it? That's great. That'll make that meat more valuable. Well, the stronger people in the village go, well, yeah, I'm now in charge of cured meat because it's the most valuable thing. And we've got to make sure it's protected. And you come up with all of these codes, little mini rules that are sort of married with imminent sort of realities, because nothing lasts more than a week or two. You don't store canned goods in primitive cultures. There's no long-term batteries. This is not how it works. It's a very quick burn-through culture. You have a handful of maybe hash marks at best that you've got this much food or this much meat, or you have to keep moving and you have to keep going. And over time, the rules of who can marry who lives with who, how these people work, become developed. You can't have everyone living in the same 2 square feet or inside the same house or yurt or tent or longhouse or anything else. So over time, these other groups break off and you have tribes that are actually all connected. They're living in different places, moving around. But at some point you hit critical mass. That critical mass is water. Water's fucked up for people. If you don't know, water's really hard to get. It's not for us. We have. You can walk to the faucet and go get it. Most of the world has plumbing now, and even places that don't have plumbing, they have shitty water, but they have water. But there's a problem with getting to water when there's nothing there. Is you get buckets and you go to a river and you bring it back. But you can't do that after a certain number of people. Once you have a certain number of people, you have a conflict. You have conflicts between any agrarian sort of watering for berries or for growing corn or whatever the fuck is going on. And this is Oriental Despotism, great book, Wittfogel, Marxist sort of historian. And someone goes, well, we need a way to manage water. We need to bring in a lot more water, and we can't have people walking 2 hours to the thing. We can't have people walking, that many people. It's too much work for too many people. So we're going to build an aqueduct. Now we're fucked. The moment you do that, the moment you're like, we need to do a collective project that's going to take more than 2 seconds. Now we've got a guy managing. Because we need to. You need to have someone managing it. And you need to have people who are doing nothing but building the aqueduct. But building the aqueduct isn't productive on a daily basis. Building the aqueduct does fucking nothing on a daily basis. There's going to be an aqueduct at some point that's good, but it does nothing. So they need to be fed. Their families need to be taken care of. They need pay effectively. They need to be taken care of. But also the people who are taking care of them now need to be taken care of. So suddenly you have a need to redistribute so all of these other side projects can happen. And the people who run this, you don't want to piss off. If I'm the guy in charge of that project and you're a farmer, you kind of don't want to make me angry. Not intentionally, but you really don't want me upset, or you don't want to do wrong by me. No, I have a little bit of, special control. I have a little bit of despotic power that grows imminently. The opposite of imminent. I should not use that word. It grows immensely as soon as I can, as soon as the water's there, because I determine where it goes. I can control water. And this is how came about. This is the founding of the first civilized city, whatever we want to call it. This is where history began, because now we needed to not only have all of those things, but we needed a system to keep track of it. And hash marks don't work anymore. We needed language. We needed a way for someone to communicate with someone the next day, or in another part of the city with someone running between them, or just notes. We needed that. Writing began being sort of a force of writing began being developed. And as this happened, as water and power and control sort of came about, the despot, the person at the power, it wasn't about the person. We mistake this a lot. It's about the position. Because very quickly, as the position melded, as they became a symbol of everything, suddenly their will was all that mattered. Prior to this, it was the earth's will. In every tribe, this is how they talked about it. They spoke of a good harvest, hoping for a good weather, hoping for rain, hoping for sun, hoping for all of these things. And when that didn't happen, it felt bad because it sucked. The earth was literally where we had our territorialization. We had territory on it. We would materially affect the earth, and the earth would affect us. There was no break. There's reason that people developed different cultures if they were living in a valley where you could have rice versus a Sahara where you couldn't. Like, people emerged differently out of these things. But once you had cities, groups of people that were managed, you needed a person in charge. You needed management. You need bureaucracy. And the formative version of this is the despot. Now, over time, as the despot concentrated power and they grew really fast. These empires grew really fucking fast. This didn't take a long time for us to get to Alexander the fucking Great, to get to Charlemagne, to get to fucking Genghis Khan, to get to any of the dynasties in China. Name a thing. For thousands of years, we had despots. And everything was through this person, through Caesar, through king, whatever it was. But it was a position. It's not a person. And we became married and understood this position to be in control of us, to be in control of everything, because they fucking kind of were. If they said we died, we died. We didn't get water, we didn't get water, we died. So you do everything you can. Like, it sucks. Like, you do that. And they did this until money. And money has always been around, but money did a weird thing, because very quickly as money became a thing, we had more and more value. You can see this in the 1300s, 1400s, 1500s as these empires grew and they expanded and they fucking had these huge ships and they would go fucking murder a bunch of people to take all their gold or all their value. This, not capitalism, just being shitty, just like shitty people. But at some point, people who had that money realized that instead of, going and buying silk somewhere and then taking it to where there was no silk and selling it for a big profit, why would I spend that much money doing it? Why would I actually own that business? Why wouldn't I own the finance behind that business and do nothing? So I would invest in people who would invest. I would invest in a business. This changed the dynamic of how people sort of found extractive profit, because now people didn't need to do anything in order to make money. And as money was made and value produced, and it was produced in insane numbers, now it wasn't concentrated in one place anymore. Suddenly it was distributed across a lot of what we would call corporations or businesses. Well, in that decentralization of things, even though capitalism is deeply centralized, versus a monarchy with a monetary system, not as centralized. It's just not as centralized. So they found that money actually took a lot more power. The American Revolution, literally about taxes. That's what they tell people. It wasn't about freeing man. We had a lot of people we didn't free. A lot of people. And then others that George Washington decided to massacre and murder to take their land so he could make more profit. That money and capital shifted what was valued, because it became who can make the most value, who can make the most money. So we lost the coding that was overcoded by the despot, that capital came in and usurped by completely breaking down all of the old codes into pure value exchange, pure value and abstraction. That move changed how we understand not just territorialization, not just our territory, not just what we're connected to or how we can own or what the limitations of that are, but that also changed within us the territoriality of the world, the context of which we see separating ourselves and other things. It's no longer that I am a citizen of America. I'm a citizen of the earth. I'm a citizen of North America. I'm a member of the white race, the weird colored hair people, the streamer nation, whatever the fuck you want to do. This system shifted how meaning is made to be that of capital, pure value exchange in the axiomatic. So when we talk about what is happening now, it isn't that Trump is becoming a despot. We cannot go back to a code system. Like, that's not a thing that happens. It's like asking someone to watch Usual Suspects a second time and be surprised, or that Memento is great the fifth time around. It's not. Like, once you know and you have an understanding, or you've broken these things down, once you understand value as an abstract concept, that other shit doesn't matter anymore. You can't have those codes. The reason these new codes, and I'm putting them in quotes, big quotes, codes seem to work, is because they're in line with the axiomatized structures of old that capitalism's using. And they're only using it insofar as it delivers value. That's it. The old codes of, well, women don't do hard work or brutal work, that shifted during World War II real fast when we needed that. And then post-World War II, women found their way back to the workforce, not so much in manufacturing jobs for a few years, but these things, these rules break down. Like, even in wartime, if there was a social code that was a certain thing, you wouldn't go, well, look, for efficiency's sake, we'll let women do this. For efficiency's sake, we just won't have that code this week. That's not how that works. Capitalism is the one that does that. For efficiency's sake, we will do this. For efficiency's sake, we will do that. For value, we will do this. For the increase and growth of all of it. That's the core rule of capitalism, and all of these things revolve. Donald Trump's not going to be a new despot. He's a mini despot, wannabe despot, but really what he is he's a capitalist. And he's a capitalist who's in line with the worst parts of capital. That's why he rose to the top. Don't be thinking that there is this great man theory that people are of their choices, and he wants something that he wasn't produced to do. We are results of our material conditions. He's not a despot. He's not. Capitalism is in charge, and he's at the pinnacle of it. And he's actually now subsumed and being taken over by Elon Musk, who's at the pinnacle of that, and also the people behind him and the banks and everything that are bankrolling all that they're doing. These systems, this isn't some weird conspiracy thing where it's like, oh, 7 Jews in a cave are running shit, right-wing nutcase shit. No, capitalism is doing this. And this is what, as a collective, people value and people are invested in. That's why you see a lot of people when it comes to Trump and the stuff he's doing, you see a huge number of people who ostensibly would be opposed to him, but they're not saying the thing that is opposed. They're not saying, oh, don't fire a whole bunch of government employees. Oh, the government isn't filled with a bunch of waste. Oh, the government and U.S. aid aren't like people like what he's doing and how he's behaving and what he's doing across the board. There's a huge amount of social investment in, especially in America. It's easy to do, especially amongst the liberal class. It's very easy. So again, saying he's a despot does wrong to the people who were. Now, he's a piece of shit dictator, wannabe in a capitalist system. But despot in Anti-Oedipus is particular. It's a position. It's a symbolic position. And Donald Trump does not occupy that. It just doesn't. Capital occupies that. No. I mean, despotism, all your values are determined by the king. We go through exegesis of language. What does the king mean? What does God mean? What is meant by this sentence? Oh, Lord. But we don't do that when it comes to literally anything else. What is the most valuable is it. And once we've made that switch, once we know and have the efficiency, the brutal, ruthless efficiency of capitalism, it's very difficult for us to go back to a system where we just sort of ignore the way that abstraction works and reinvest 100% of our subjectivity in something we're not invested in. Like, again, this is going back presumes that one, we aren't produced by the past. This is we are produced by the past. We are moving through time historically and socially. I am 44, going to be 45 fucking this year. And I can remember what it was like when I was younger and how things are changing and how things are moving. But it's a continuous process of deconstruction, deterritorialization, and decoding that is taking place, that capital is absolutely behind. And that setup, we may find that there are archaisms that capital is willing to bring forth, like a dictator. Dictators exist in capitalism. Like, there are kings of very capitalist countries in the world. The UK has ostensibly a king, as an example, but there are countries in Southeast Asia that are straight up monarchies that are playing with capitalism. Like, it's not a wild ride to say that we're going to end up with someone who has autocratic power, but that's not the same thing as a despot, where everyone is bending heel and their subjectivity is determined directly by that person. It's not. Wig, do you contend we can go back to feudalism, more archaic political forms, the despotic? I think we're going to find new forms of things. I'm always hesitant to say the idea of us going back, because it presumes that there is a similarity into what we're experiencing and what was. And there is in an analogical way, perhaps, but the reality is how we exist today, how our material conditions exist today are so deeply unique versus what they were. I'm not sure how we could possibly go to a position where everything a peasant believes is what God told him or what he read in a book or what the king's edicts were. Like, I'm not sure how that would even work. We may have some science fiction that sort of plays in that direction, but like at what point is that no longer efficient for capital? Capital doesn't give a shit. Capital will turn on whoever it needs to because it doesn't care. It doesn't give a fuck about repressing you It doesn't give a fuck about freeing you. It doesn't care about anything. It's deeply, deeply non-personal, just making everything deeply efficient and running along its way. The old power structures that it needs to be able to maintain doing this and maintain it in a social order, that's the stuff that we're contending with, I think, by and large, and that it's sort of recoding everything as, or re-territorializing things under, if that makes sense. It's, again, we're going to get to the positive and negative tasks of schizoanalysis as they describe it, where they're going to go through a great deal of this. But there's a wonderful book called State and Marx, written by Sibertin. I'm going to get his fucking name wrong. I want to get it right. 2 seconds. I will never pronounce his name right, I'm sure. Guillaume Sibertin Blanc. State and Politics, Deleuze and Guattari on Marx, that goes through ultimately how the state has shifted in just Deleuze and Guattari's lifetime, but they go through it through Marx, and he talks about it sort of how their view of the state and what may come or how it can be. Again, it's not that we're moving forward towards a utopia. I'm also not saying that. But it's also not that we're falling backwards, because shit doesn't work like that. We're beyond certain things. Like, again, this is that, how do you go back to having a king give edicts when everyone knows it's bullshit? Like, even MAGA people, like, he gives an order that is counter to them. Are they going to obey? No. Like, he just happens to be doing a lot of stuff that upsets libs and lefties, and that's because he's bred of resentment and his people are bred of resentment. That's what they respond to. Right? Josh has asked, if the model of despotism can't apply to Trump, it can also not apply to 1930s European fascism. Of course. I mean, Nazism is fascism and capitalism. They invented the term privatization. It'd be really hard for me to say that the Nazis were despotic when they went to decentralized privatization of the public sector. When Mussolini's primary work on fascism talked about the corporate necessity and how government was there to be merged with the corporate state. Like, these are not despotic, centralized power things, despite the state being in that position. It doesn't work the same way as a king, where everything is through the king. Yes. Well, so it's not, I may, yeah. So specifically MAGA as a movement is born of resentment, particularly weaponized by Fox News and others. They really like it when liberals are upset. And Ben Shapiro has a mug that says liberal tears. Like, it's that kind of like, Trump says a thing and you'll see, someone asked, Trump how, sort of point blank, since the federal government decided en masse to ignore Elon's email, how much power does he truly have? Something like that. And Trump responded by saying, who do you work for? And they said ABC, and he goes, figures. And the room laughed. That is him shitting on, oh, look, he's showing those liberals. Like, it's like, but it's not a point. He didn't say anything that they're even invested in. What he did is he displayed anger at the people they're angry at. It's resentment as a political movement. That's what MAGA ultimately is. And I would say a lot of pseudo-leftism is as well, but that's a whole other discussion. Yeah, it's anytime you see a political moment where someone is happy that someone else is suffering and they're enjoying that, that's not good. That's resentment sort of in a thing. You see a lot of people on Reddit love to make the comment about the leopards ate my face party, where like someone, their dad or their family gets like, a guy's wife got deported and he was a mega voter, and he's crying on TikTok. He's like, what the fuck am I going to do? These kids, what am I going to do? What do I tell them about their mom? And everyone's like, ha 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 ha. And I'm like, holy fuck, guys. Like, what are you doing? Like you can't enjoy suffering. I don't care. Like, that's the challenge. And so again, when I talk about this, like, he's able to maintain the power. What he's doing is this stuff. But when he does stuff that is counter to MAGA, when he does stuff that's counter to his base or to their actual interests, he still gets pushback, and it's happening. It's a thing you can see in town halls that are happening. It's not all the time. And there's a lot more rage that the media is not reporting on because, again, the media is very different than it used to be. But this is not the world. This is not the immediate realities of people. So when we talk about the despot, when we talk about, oh, Trump is going to do all this, it's like, look, where we're at is a dangerous moment in history, but this isn't a movement back to that where the despot controls everything and our subjectivity is formed from birth through them in every single meaningful way. That's not how this has worked. My kid's not going to grow up thinking Donald Trump is God. Like, this is it's a broken way to talk about the way that it used to be. Instead, let's talk about where we're at and what we can be doing next. Tends to be my argument. Oh, 1 second. Sorry. You're going to have to, I didn't have you on YouTube's, and I want people to hear what you're saying. Sorry, if you could start over.
So I just noticed from my interesting or a little bit too much of a background, some people, they are obviously having this kind of resentment in the discourse. Some people don't have it. Like, they don't have it. They think, yeah, they're just hitting each other, but they don't, like, no one will get something out of it. Hitting each other doesn't produce anything, right? But there's another group that they exhibit resentment and non-resentment at the same time. And I found this part very interesting. It has to do with that, either or either or. It goes straight back to the Oedipus thing. But, we can talk about it later. It's a lot of histories.
Well, and again, we can talk about places where you can actually see the despotic did show up, and it's in really the most brutal conditions. American caste systems have been really awful for years, but it's hard to say that there's like a despotic or a subjectivity in that sense. But there used to be. Chattel slavery, as it operated, people were literally torn apart, families destroyed, women raped, men raped, children raped, murdered, beheaded in front of their families, awful shit that happened throughout chattel slavery. And the existence that these people led was one that was not informed of the outside world. It was brutalized, and they were literally living moment to moment. That's the closest you can get to talking about the existence of subjectivity that one might have had in these other periods, because you don't have an existence outside of the will of the person who literally controls your life. We're not there yet. I don't see us necessarily getting there tomorrow. We may get there. Hey, I am continually disappointed by the world. So sure. But it takes that level of control over life and death that that positions control over life and death. Some people may have that fear now. Sure. But we also have an understanding of how it sort of exists in, the larger context of things. This is a different type of subjectivity, and it's important to consider from that position how these things go. What's up, Josh's?
Hello. Yeah, you said earlier that, it was sort of acted as kind of a rationalization. If you go back into sort of U.S. history, you look at the founders and you look at sort of the, their, the way that they justified or articulated with a highfalutin language of rights and, going back to Rousseau and Locke, you see it in the Declaration of Independence that, that it's sort of, well, that's not really what's going on, because you really have to look at sort of the, the machinations of capitalism to understand it. But I suppose you could also argue, and I think, Deleuze sort of would, does argue this way, that it's not as if sort of those highfalutin values are just kind of like, a surface rationalization. But if you look at what those values are based in, sort of, the structure of the the philosophical underpinnings themselves are perfectly reflective of, the machinations of capitalism. That they're expressions of it. So in other words, that they're not sort of masking something, or they're not kind of a misrepresentation. They're a perfectly accurate representation, sort of just sort of in a different form. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yes. Well, and it's the
American pragmatism.
We have a fantasy when we this happens a lot in fiction, and you see this happen. Stargate's very, very guilty of this, but it's what I still love Stargate. But it's you see this a lot where they go into some medieval town, or where there's a king, or there are gods that are literally gods that can kill people, and there's always tons of rebel groups, or people are aware that the gods aren't really gods, and of this larger meta narrative. That kind of thing, that's not how people really meaningfully operated. There are people who did, but as far as like many people, it's pushing it. And when we start talking about how we speak today of, it's common, almost boringly common for people to talk about, yeah, there's going to be a civil war. Someone's going to overthrow the government. Oh, there's a coup. We throw around coup and bandy that term all the time. And we see them happen a lot. Like we actually see them happen in the last 20, 30 years, a shit ton. It's not really a thing that used to happen ton back in the day, because these people were the voice of God. They were the position. They were the reverence, your reverence. They were in this space. And again, the subjectivity that exists there is very particular. And again, people are made by their material conditions. They cannot have experiences that they don't have. So the idea that people who lived in brutal times where the king literally just had whoever they wanted murdered for fun and lived in, squalid, awful conditions for decades, that those people would have any semblance of the same reality or understanding of the world that I do, or that even uneducated people in various places or anywhere in the world is completely asinine to me. Like how do people have experiences that they don't have? I've never understood that as a concept. I don't know. I felt like that's where you're going too, Josh. Is I just I don't know. Maybe not.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I was just saying that some people might. You hear people make this argument. They say, well, okay, so the system is sort of co-opted by such and such forces or whatever, and we're not living up to our highest values. So you can pick, from a checklist, well, what do they mean by highest values? Oh, it could be, Enlightenment values, but if you look at the basis, the structure of those values themselves, they already reflect the kind of, capitalist axiomatic is already built into that way of thinking. I go back to Deleuze and his discussion, his picking at Rorty, and that, and his notion of pragmatism, and, good-minded people sitting around a table and coming to agreement, so that's the basis of that kind of pragmatism, right? So that would be an example of some sort of a higher set of values that a group of people could say, well, we're not living up to those. If we could just go back and sort of, and practice that pragmatism, right? And Deleuze would say, well, that is, in fact, you are practicing it, and that's what, you have to understand, what he's arguing about the nature of capitalism in order to see that the very ideal, the very achievement of the effective practice of pragmatism, and the way that sort of Rorty has in mind, would it precisely keep us in the situation we're in right now.
Yes. Well, and it's, you see it in some of my favorite leftist memes have actually, I think, covered this sort of in a meaningful way. The meme, we need more women drone pilots, or we need more women police officers, because there's this, again, as we move forward and as we do things, the idea of what emancipation means, or the idea of what being free means, or the idea of what any of this means, for a lot of people, it doesn't mean breaking down the system and making true emancipation happen. Instead, it's just about making sure that they're also included in the power structure, that someone that like them is. So you have this really weird tension where you talk about like Martin Luther King Jr., who decidedly talked about the economic realities of the need for socialism and how there's nothing that can be done in terms of race reparations unless we completely break down capitalism. He wrote about this shit. This isn't like, I'm not making this up. Like he talked about this. But then how they whitewash it and they talk about it is like, well, look, we've got a black justice on the Supreme Court who fucking apparently hates black people. We have like, it's just this insane. And again, this is how identity ends up working really well within capital, within the image of these things and how these sort of things play. Because you start talking about this image of a thing, and is it emancipatory? Is it the thing that's going to free us? When really what it's doing is it's playing with those images and it's breaking the old codes. Well, look, it's a gay couple's adopting kids, yes, but one of them has completely taken the position of the traditional mom and the other's the traditional dad, and they're raising their kids and sending them to a Catholic school. I'm not sure that this is the emancipatory reality that like it's a different thing when we start talking about what it means to actually have these things break down. Right now, most people are starting to see, I think, I'm hoping, I have faith that these structures are themselves challenging and themselves dangerous. And I think there's a lot of stuff that has sort of built over time that we're dealing with and tarrying with now. This is like a bill coming due, more or less. And we've got a lot of work to do in order to fix it if we want to. But it's not about being scared, oh no, Donald Trump's going to become a despot. Look, it's going to be a long couple of fucking decades and maybe centuries. But Donald Trump's he's not going to be around for a decade. Like being a despot for like 20 minutes and then what happens then? The reality of how these things get invested and the complexity of it, it's not Trump, it's the structures, it's the investments, the social investments in capital. My video, and I do encourage people to watch it because it's explicit. We've seen Donald Trump be a cuckold for capital, and that thing doesn't earn respect. It isn't something people can invest in. It's not something that gets them excited in that way. They're moving on to Elon, or they're moving on to other people for that reason. These investments are complicated, and it's far more than just Donald Trump's a cool guy and I kind of like him. People are not that simple. That's their post-personal. That's how they say things. Listen to them, but understand that there's a lot more behind all of these things, ultimately. Ultimately, there's a lot more behind it. And that's... yeah, please.
Mm-hmm. I noticed that there's a sneering to the people who kind of what we call in strictly Marxist sense the ideological class, the people in the bureaucracy, the federal workers, right? Mm-hmm. What we call them. And I noticed some kind of people, especially on TikTok, I don't know if they are leftist, but they kind of feed on this kind of the sadness of these people who get fired by Donald Trump just because they voted for him, And I kind of I'm standing in the middle, I'm not from America, but we shouldn't do that. We shouldn't do it. I don't know, you shouldn't make fun of these people, right? Even if they vote for Trump, right? Even if they vote for and regret it, right? That's not the way to go about, right? The way to kind of approach it.
No, well, it's also important to remember that we, on the liberal, the left, the media, whatever we want to say, everyone likes to totalize everybody. But just I can't imagine anyone who'd go, look, you voted for Biden, you got everything you deserve. No one would say that because no one likes Biden. No one was fucking rock hard and turgid going into the voting booth going, fucking Biden's my guy. Instead it was, fuck, most people were reticent and did what we had to do and hit the switch. Same with Hillary. The number of people who actually were that thing is not as many as people like to think. I argue greatly The same is true of Trump. The idea that even if people were excited to vote for him, that they're 100% on board with everything, this totalizes and simplifies people in a really weird way in a world that is far, far messier and more complicated. And so instead, again, why this book is important, why this section is important, we're going to read the next bits about all of this. It's important for us to understand how capitalism constrains what we see as our options and trains and builds into us the limitations that we don't even see, that we don't even know are there, and that are just part of the condition that we exist within. That'd be my argument. And it's a tough time. I come from the games and entertainment industry, and it's not just games and entertainment, it's tech, it's everything. There's no investment, there's no money in anything. We have we're in a recession. Whether or not the media wants to call it that, because we have great, like, they use the Dow Jones as an indicator, which no one who's an investor fucking even talks about in that way. Like, we're in a recession. There's no funding for anything. There's no money flowing into stuff. Everything's stalled out. We're fucked. And that problem is that it takes time. It takes time. There's a latency between when these things hit and when it really creates pressure. And we're experiencing the beginnings of latency hitting for some of this stuff, and it's just going to grow. Go look at town hall videos. It'll make you feel better if you really want to. I think it's a lot. Pedro says, I think there's a difference between 2016 Trump voters and 2024. I don't. I mean, I think there's a reality to the way and how images are shown to people, and how people's investments are being utilized, and how people are being driven, and how that driving becomes a self-fulfilling sort of reality, and how then, again, the conditioning of our understanding of things, it's the same for them. I grew up in a place where I didn't know any black people. I did not know how to act around black people. That's a stupid statement. I didn't know it was a stupid statement. I didn't have experience. I was raised in a place that was decidedly fucked up racist. Decidedly. And it took like a lot of time and work to understand what it meant when I talked about the other people or anyone else in any of these categories. That's how this works. You don't have the experience, you don't know. In fact, you rabbit hole, and everyone has rabbit holed in the last 8 years. We've all gone into these tiny little pockets of the internet and sectioned ourselves off from friends. How many people actually go to people's houses anymore? like, I mean it. Like, how often do you go out and meet people? I used to go fucking out to clubs and bars 3-4 times a week in early 2010s, all the way through like 2018, 19. Post-COVID, no one does that. Like, no one. I mean, like, most people can't afford to, but like, social life's dead. People are stuck in the same people. You people are finding me because of an algorithm at best, or you've been part of my world for years, or someone is who referred you. We're rabbit holed. We're stuck in these positions. Understanding where we're stuck and being able to critique that is the important thing. Go for it. Go for it.
So I started living in Southern California about 2016. I can kind of tell you, I'm not sure it's because I was mentally ill at that time, very specifically, or it's because, it's almost as if when you say, people don't go to each other's houses, or people don't go to clubs, or they don't talk with people when they're in the bars or in the clubs. I can give you a very specific example to demonstrate my point, right? So for the first year, when I was, when I was still living in the university campus, there was this party, quote unquote party. Everyone's in their phone. There's like 20 people in the room. Every single person is leaning against the wall and play on their phone. They're doing Snapchat or something, right? So for me, it was the most bizarre experience, because it seems like they have the expectation to talk with someone while talking with no one in reality. And at that time, I feel like, yeah, people seem to be going to these places, but it seems like they carry some sort of expectation. And then Zoom, fast forward about 8 or 9 years later after COVID, then I'm still living at the same space, and it seems like people are more outgoing in certain way, because the post-COVID generation of the college students, they seems to be much better at actually handling some sort of conversation, or just when they're talking with people. However, the thing you said about people naturally just don't go to each other's houses, and even if when go to bars and clubs, they don't really talk with anyone that they don't know. I feel like that thing is still there. I don't think it really changed that much. People started to smoke a lot more weed, doing a lot more drugs, and just smoke a lot more. It's in general is worse, but I feel like there is a little bit difference in the college population, because they were forced to take classes online for years. I think after they are pushed through that production, they know it's not very good to go to other people's places and just play with their phones all the time. So there seems to be a little bit of difference, but it's not disaccordance with what you said. It's the same thing. What the main currents is still, people just smoke weed all the time because they don't want to enjoy, they want to enjoy their rent. I think that's what they call it these days. Yeah. They want to enjoy their expensive rent and then smoke weed in their house and doesn't talk with anyone except swipe Snapchat. That thing is still there, right? But that thing is like a general thing. But in the college population, there seem to be a little bit more, I would say it's significantly more outgoing. Overall, it's still kind of, everyone's still busy.
It has its moments, yeah. And again, I'm talking just in general. There have been studies over the last few years that people are sort of shutting off. But again, the other side of that is the algorithmic shift of what the internet is, how it brings us together, how it trains us. But again, all of this is sort of, again, I have my experiences. Experiences are what I come from. These things can be learned by experience. Life is what it is. There isn't a transcendent sort of thing that is innate to the back of my brain that I just have to access. It's experience. Same with everyone else. It's the same with everyone else. And that's, I'm going to keep moving us forward because it's part of this and the shift that happens within capital. Big one, it's going to be labor. Because how we labor, like what we do, what you build, labor. And labor isn't just going to a factory and working. Labor is work, like effort, work, whatever you want to do. There's a great book on it by a guy named Marx, but also I would recommend Ricardo, who goes, I think, into labor in a nice, tends to be non-controversial way. If you ever want to talk about it with someone who's not on the same side of the world you are, or the same side of politics, Ricardo's lovely. Same with Smith, by the way. Capitalists love Smith until they read him, because then they realize they're nuts. But labor is an abstract thing. We didn't really talk about labor as labor prior to labor. So the concept of it. Prior to the concept of labor, people would work. And people would build things and people would do stuff. And they tended to talk about the actual product that's being made as the thing. And so when you do that in an economy, it makes it difficult to sort of talk about large scale things. You talk about money and capital flowing, sure. But until you talk about labor, you're not really talking about like the stuff. So we have labor, and capital uses labor. And Marx is going to talk about labor. We're going to get into this. Just skip Ricardo. I think it's worth reading, but yeah, Marx good. Marx is good. All right. Marx summarizes the entire matter. One sec. I reinstalled Discord and it turned all my fucking notifications on. So give me 2 seconds. I have to turn all of this. I hate Discord so much. I wonder if anyone else hates Discord as much as me. Probably not. Where is just frustrating. Where the fuck is the notifications? Just terrible. Boop, 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 boop. Just one sec. Sorry, everyone. I promise I'll figure out someday how to do anything quickly and efficiently. No notifications. And no. And No audio. I don't want any. I have to click every one of these. Wonderful. That's frustrated. That's frustrating. User leave, user moved. God damn. They have so many of these fucking things. And I can't mute Discord because then you guys can't hear all my wonderful people who are talking. All right. Allow me to continue. Oh, 61. Welcome back, 61. You did this yesterday. Why'd you have to reinstall Discord? Marx summarizes the entire matter by saying that the subjective abstract essence is discovered, it's labor, by capitalism only to be put in chains all over again, to be subjugated and alienated. No longer it is true in an exterior and independent element as objectivity, but in the element itself subjective of private property. Quote, what was previously being external to oneself, man's externalization in the thing, has merely become the act of externalizing, the process of alienating. It is, in fact, the form of private property that conditions the conjunction of the decoded flux, which is to say, their axiomatization in a system where the flux of the means of production, as the property of the capitalists, is directly related to the flux of so-called free labor, as the property of the workers, so that the state restrictions on the substance or the content of private property do not at all affect this form. It is also the form of private property that constitutes the center of the factitious reterritorializations of capitalism. And finally, it is this form that produces the images filling the capitalist field with immanence, the capitalist, the worker, etc. In other terms, capitalism indeed implies the collapse of the great objective determinant representations for the benefit of production as the universal interior essence, but it does not thereby escape the world of representation. It merely performs a vast conversion of this world by attributing it to the new form of an infinite subjective representation. I know it's a lot. Order of Things, my favorite Foucault book. They're going to quote, Michel Foucault shows that the human sciences found their principle in production and were constituted on the collapse of representation, but that they immediately reestablish a new type of representation as unconscious representation. Order of Things is phenomenal. That it supports a lot of when they talk about the critique of representation. Order of Things is great, actually. All right. So, Marx in Capital, you may have guessed, it's kind of the book he does most of his shit in, talks about how labor is sort of discovered by capital or freed by capital. When capitalism comes along and we start seeing the job of the blacksmith broken down, so it's not a single person doing a ton of back-breaking labor only to be alienated from his production. He externalizes his labor into an object. The understanding of that labor as the value that capitalism takes on. But when it does that, it actually chains it again. It was chained. Labor was chained in that way, but it only re-alienates it because these no longer external objects, no longer is it because I made a table and it's now that. It's much different. It's done now because it's made private property. It's made separate from everything, kind of. There's an immediate alienating thing. So they say, the Marx quote they have, what was previously being external to oneself, man's externalization in the thing, I built a thing, I made a thing, my labor externalized, blah, has merely become the act of externalizing, this process of alienating. It's no longer that I put myself in that. It's now the process itself. This is Marx's economic and philosophical manuscripts, but this is about how alienation changed to the process of labor. As in core Marx, basic stuff. So they quote Marx here, give a very light, basic description of it. Then they say, it is in fact the form of private property that conditions the conjunction of the decoded flux, which is to say their axiomatization in a system where the flux of the means of production as the property of capitalists is directly related to the flux of so-called free labor as the property of the workers. So think of the flux, the rate of change, again, boiled down to the most basic fucking value abstraction that you can mathematically, the differential, effectively, the rate of change, the flux of it. The way that this sort of shifts is because private property now becomes how capitalism manages this decoded flux of desire and labor. Codes used to control desire. They would code or overcode and sort of repress through that. But now it's done in the process of labor, in the process of desiring production itself. Okay, so desire is liberated. The potential is enormous. I think you probably experience this. Everything seems possible. Everything seems possible. It's not. It's not. Realistically, it's not. But it's everything is kind of possible. You can see this the way that capitalists talk. Absolutely. The techno-capitalist feudalist fucks in Silicon Valley who are like, oh no, all we need is a crypto rocket and it'll automatically mine Mars for all of the lithium we'll ever need and we can live in a utopia. That kind of shit. There's like this liberate. It's liberating, but it's not just that. It's not just that. The way that they're phrasing it here, the form of private property that conditions. The form of private property that conditions the conjunction, how these come together of the decoded flux. The flux of the means of production, property of capitalists, directly related to the flux of so-called free labor, the property of the workers. You have your labor. The fluxion of these two, the conjunction of these elements. And then they have the line, so that the state restrictions on the substance or content of private property do not at all affect this form. The fundamental form of this relationship does not change no matter what the laws are. That's all they're saying there. It's not crazy. The structure itself, it doesn't matter of how there are restrictions on the content or rules. It has to be 8 hours a day maximum and you must pay overtime. Actually, we're going to switch to a 4-hour work week, or we're going to allow children to do it, or we're going to allow visas. It doesn't matter. None of that shit changes that fundamental conjunction. That is where capital does this work, and where your desire and labor and that of that of everyone comes sort of together. But it's done through this territorialization as private property, as privatized. Yours, your labor, your capital, yours, mine, my labor, my capital. That thing. This is the re-territorialization. All of these things broken down, made yours, mine, whatever. And ours is a fun one. Now think about how identity plays into that. You can start saying, I'll stop. That's not part of this paragraph. I should shut the fuck up. It is also the form of private property that constitutes the center of the factitious re-territorializations of capitalism. Those artificial boundaries, the artificial limits that are placed at the edges of capital. We don't want to go too far with that. There's this, we don't make things like that. This is not going to be worth money. This doesn't justify being made. This isn't efficient. Blah, 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 blah. All of that shit that is completely abstractly bullshit. Like it's crap. That is the new boundary that capitalism's put in place. We used to have codes. Codes have sort of an imminent limit. Like they are the limit. Codes are it. The despot overcoding are it. There isn't like stuff beyond that. That limit is baked into the code. Once it's decoded and re-territorialized and made private, now the limit's within you. What you can do is based on all of that other shit, and you're conditioned that way. And the limits are built into you. Not into society. At large, they are. In aggregate, that's the rules. Women get paid less than men. It's not really That's not a transcendent thing. That's not a rule of society. There isn't someone somewhere with a ledger saying, oh, fuck, John got a pay cut. We've got to cut Susie's pay. Like, in aggregate, these numbers come together. In aggregate, these rules play. Your rules play with everyone else's. Your rules play into everyone else's. They connect with everyone else's. They're part of it. And finally, it is this form that produces the images filling the capitalist field of immanence, the capitalist and the worker, etc. Once you have capital, private property especially, generating roles. Oh, I have the role of a worker. My labor is for X, Y, and Z. I am a capitalist. They are a capitalist because they are invested in me. Blah, 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 blah. All of that shit. That's fine as a thing, right? Well, that's the self-contained set of capitalism, the system of capitalism, the axiomatic of capitalism, creating those rules within you. Hyper-privatized capitalism. Oh, standing reserve. Don't. Women work less hours on average. Great. That's, so do guys named Paul. Who gives a fuck? Aggregate realities are really fun that way because they don't mean anything to any individual person. We use them in order to create narratives and reify our own understandings of things, but they're not useful in terms of understanding what people are or what people want. You can understand how people are allowed. For example, just as a thing, people who are right-handed tend to be better heavy hitters in baseball. There's absolutely no fucking reason for that. Well, except for the fact that there are more lefties. More righties, I mean. That's the way it works. More righties, more people overall, the average goes up. So the gregarious aggregate and law of large numbers sets it up to be that way. When you have social realities that are feeding into systems, the rules and the aggregate realities don't determine what's there. We pretend they do. I am a white man in America, and I am in, I don't know, the last year's been tough, and I have no money in my bank account, but that's fine. It's a tough time. Where's my class position? Am I working class? Am I not? I wasn't before. I was a CEO. I was a CEO a few years ago. But what's my position? What do I sit at? Am I an ally of the right or left? Well, if you see the comments on my videos, I'm certainly not an ally to either because everyone's deciding these things based on a whole bunch of shit. Privately, personally, themselves, their territories. This is the setup. This is the way it works. As they say in other terms, capitalism indeed implies the collapse of the great objective determinate representation because things were determinate. That's the fun part. That's how we get completely fucked. The way that things were, men did X, Y, and Z, it was determinate because a king said so. That's how that's set up because the social order said so. There's none of that anymore. There's no reason for any, it's not determinate anymore. What a blacksmith is, I don't have to do what my dad did for a living. Neither did you. Neither does anyone. We can choose to, but we don't have to. We did kind of have to. And our social positions were determined by things way outside of our control before we ever were even born. People knew what their kids were going to do for their entire lives before they were even married to someone else. That's social determination. That doesn't exist anymore. Not in the same way. Now it's bubbling up. Now it's emergent from the properties of the social structure. But we still have people who talk about these things as if they're real. They're real within them. They're privatized. They're reterritorialized. That's how the ego and all of this other shit operates. Self-help and all this garbage. Yeah.
Brooke, about this determination of familial thing,
Mm-hmm.
it's determined in another way. I want to speak with you about like a little experience I have. Probably better because it's gonna kind of take some time, but not too long, maybe like 10 minutes, but after the reading. I think you might be very interested in this case, but it does have to do with how these definitions of political stuff are determined by private people all the time, and you can't really have like a agreed upon definition, and then you can't align according to the parents, according to the politic group, you can't really align that. I want to share about this part and see
So
what
are
you
you
think.
agreeing with me or disagreeing? It sounds like you have agreement.
I am agreeing with part of what you said, and I'm not sure about the other parts that it's too vague. You know, it's just too vague in some way. And I only want to share about this specific example.
Let me give some specific examples.
Okay.
There are people who feel and probably are put in positions where they are under immense social pressures to end up where dad wants them to be or mom wants them to be, or where their family wants them to be, or what their family needs to do. I watched an amazing documentary about one of the last like rural families in China, and how a guy is like the last of the young people in his village, his old farming village. All the other young people left for the cities, and he's the last one. And that shift that happened there, and how he stayed until he didn't. There's a shift in that specifically that I'm talking about, where 1,000 years ago, or even 200 or 300 years ago in that village, generally speaking, you knew what your children and your grandchildren were going to do, and not in a way of like there was going to be social pressure to do it, but in a way that that's just how it was. These are the social codes. This is the setup. At some point, when there's larger overarching metas that are playing with this, China is an amazing example of this, I think, across the board. I need to find that documentary. I need to remember the name of it. It's something I won't remember because it means something a lot more in the film, and it's like it's an idiom that's local. I'm not going to get it right, but it was fucking amazing. But the battle that this guy was going through was about whether or not to honor his parents or not. That's personalized social determination. The way his parents or great grandparents or like 10 generations back worked, it wasn't that. They didn't feel pressure. Oh no, mom and dad want me to do this, but I want to do something else. It's you had your desires merged with the needs of the people that you were around.
Yeah.
And that break is something that we definitely have today. We have that break. Like that just doesn't exist in the same way. We feel pressures for sure. And we have parents guilting us and doing all kinds of shit, and social mores that say like, oh, I was born into this family, and so I probably should go into this kind of work. I probably shouldn't just be a garbage man and go do construction work, that kind of thing. But it's not quite the same thing as being fully socially determined.
Yeah, I mean, I just, maybe, I'm not sure this is the correct place to bring up, but the master and slave discourse is actually still very much present because, you know, they pretend they're not doing capitalism, but they do more capitalism than capitalistic countries in China. And then that goes to more of the, you know, oh, are they being pressured by a parent to perform certain task because there's expectations? And you know, that goes to more of the AO, the core of AO, and what does it mean to have those decoded flows. But we can chat a little bit more later because I don't think
Asia in general, there's a lot of interesting cultural shifts, and you don't see in the West, because the West, I think, has gone through a lot of these. But how in Japan, for example, one of their big issues is that people are expected to take care of their parents when they age, but there's not enough kids for this. Like this, it's just not a sustainable system in the same way.
It's not like, okay, it's not like there's not enough kids. It's more of like there's not enough money generated by the kids.
It's kind of both. There's not enough money generated by the kids, but also it used to be that families would have 5 or 6 kids. And so so like they would all sort of chip together so the money would kind of work. But again, this is more the presumptions and the changes, and then the expectations of the old social mores that are not codes anymore, but instead they're structures that are axiomatized and built in that don't make sense, that we still replicate. And the West is filled with this shit, but we're much more in the like replicating lots of really dumb shit than like still wrestling with stuff. We have weird things we're wrestling with, but we're just replicating a lot of dumb shit too. It's kind of wild.
I mean, at least there is a relative clear boundary between what makes sense and then what is not sense, right? But in some more Asian countries, these two lines are much more blurred than what is usually considered in academic field. But yeah, I don't want to drag. This is pretty related, but I don't want to drag along. I don't want to drag along the reading material. I can like. I hope that you have a few minutes of the time after the reading, so we can go.
I have to go get groceries, but we'll figure out some time. We need to figure out time. Yeah. I've been dying to. It's just life is in the way. Life is in the way, as I think it is for most of us. But this last note that they have here, it merely performs a vast conversion of this world by attributing to it the new form of an infinite subjective representation. There's a way that capitalism has of images and representation. They use the term infinite here, and it's important. Capitalism doesn't have a lot of limits. It's unbounded in the terms of what it's able to create and the systems it's able to replicate and the imagery and functions it's able to sort of put in front of us. Capitalism is astonishing this way. Magical is a fair way as far as I'm concerned, to put it, because the reality is it's not that capitalism transcends the old systems of codes or representation. It transforms it, and it's able to do this and constantly reinvent how it does this over and over and over. Because as we talk about sort of all of these things, they're leading us through, at this point, this shift to representation, the shift to the privatized version, the internal to us version of how we are made solo, singular, and us versus the world, us as an island, us as everything, and how we're then taught we have to work on us, and it's us who has to be fixed instead of the world that produced us. And it's sort of fucking with that thing. It's important to remember capitalism can do it for all of these things. It's able to fit and make all of it work. And that's, they're going to get back to the point, but go for it, Marcellus. Go for it quick, because I don't have a ton of time left, and I want to make sure I get this next paragraph.
Okay. It's kind of like there's some kind of symbolization, right? It's symbolic, the mythical figure, right? In psychoanalysis, right? And yeah, and like it's kind of like there's this kind of like, I have a question, right? So there, within social production and within the desire and production, there is a middle term where there's anti-production, right?
No, it's not a middle term. Anti-production is more complicated. I kind of don't want to we're going to get into anti-production in a chapter. And it's a lot more complicated. We're not there yet, I would say. Mm-hmm. But it's not a middle part. Anti-production is not part of like the productive process in the sense of like, oh, it goes step 1, step 2, step 3. But instead it's, how to put it? As we do shit, as desire produces and as labor works, part of all of this stuff isn't really for pure production, making something new. It's also about maintaining. And so think of it as like a little slices of energy taken off that are more about the maintenance or investment or the placement into those systems and structures to maintain them. And not directly, not explicitly, but like stuff that keeps the machine working.
Even if it's broken. Even
sure.
If it's broken.
Oh yeah. I mean, broken or not, every machine is broken. So there's no like that's the thing, is every machine's broken. So how do you keep a broken machine working? Well, you're constantly working on it as you're making new stuff. If you ever worked at like a factory floor or like a production facility, it's pretty normal. Like if you ever worked in an office and there's that copier that sucks and everyone has to deal with that fucking copier and everyone expends just a little bit of energy to deal with the paper jam every fucking time, or how the thing doesn't do it unless you do X, Y, and Z, this little bit every single time, that's about maintaining the system rather than doing more stuff. That sort of thing is happening constantly in design and production. It's not in the middle of the production process. It's just part of it, if that makes sense.
It's kind of like the wear and tear of technical social machine and the manic machine. It's kind of like in Marxist the wear on tear of technical machine. I guess that's what I
Well,
understand from
it's one of the things you'll notice when I gave my speed run of chapter 3, where we went through like the anthropological history of mankind from a very particular and in a very simplified, way oversimplified way. Do not ever just quote me on that shit. I'm just trying to help you get through this. The entirety of it is, I mentioned the guy who's like, I'll fucking manage that stuff, and he does. And it's about managing and maintaining. Now, there's a weird thing that happens, that the energy that's invested in maintaining that system, people don't realize that that's collecting profits. Think of it as profits too, by the way. It's collecting power, energy, force, and eventually maintenance actually controls production. We like to think that production is like the thing and maintenance is like the guys at the bottom, but that's not really how it works, not in practice, not over time. Over time, the maintenance of the thing, allow me, I think U.S. aid is a horrifying thing that we have as a governmental agency. I believe a lot of the work it does is incredibly important at the same time. Okay, so don't just jump right in. I'm not on Elon's side for this shit, but the big deal is U.S. aid as a program does a lot of really good shit. AIDS medicine, as an example, real basic one, but just in general, trying to make people's lives better around the world. But there's also a reality to what it does and how we maintain that system. And as that system started, may have been simple, easy. Now it's become a multi-billion-dollar sort of hegemon that is infiltrated and utilized by the CIA to recover state power. And the thing becomes, I don't like U.S. aid, but I wish they hadn't done what they did with it. Because, and this is, sure, find fault with me if you want, I guess, but for me, I'm wanting maintenance of that, because I think it's more important for people to stay alive than to destroy this system that I think ultimately does do a lot of really bad shit. I think a lot of people who look at the world and have this feeling, you get it in general. Do you want America to just collapse? Well, sure, everyone wants America to collapse. Oh, we all fucking hate America. But do you want diabetes medicine globally? Like, how do you want that to work? How do you want pharmaceuticals to work? How do you want just an extraordinary amount of shit that the U.S. is significantly a supplier of, if not in control of, through corporate hegemony? So what happens to all of that stuff? Well, maintaining some level of that previous system feels necessary. We're invested in it. It feels
and it's very
important.
Hard. And it's very hard because I worked in the NGO and with the USA and in Libya, right? And I know the level of like bureaucracy structure, the level of like planning, right? It like, yeah, I understand what you mean.
If you've ever worked at let's say a soup kitchen or food pantry that's part of a larger organization, and there's a lot of these, and they're all generally filled with very, very good people, top to bottom. There's not a lot of like cynical people who go into being in a food pantry business for the money. But as with everything, the maintenance of the group, the maintenance of the structure, the maintenance of what came before is incredibly important. This is anti-production.
Yeah. And by the way, it also needs money. By the way, it still needs money because you have to pay wages to these people, right?
Well, yeah. And again, it's what systems are we keeping in? What are we setting up? How are we doing things? So we have this really weird thing where the thing that's happening now, for a long time, the left had a great talking point called the permanent state. And it was a thing that people were really upset about. I was one of those. I'm still pissed that the fucking right decided to take this on because the left couldn't be fucked. But like the idea of the slow growth of the bureaucracy that reifies these systems that I don't really care for. When the Patriot Act brought in Homeland Security as a department, for example, I prayed that it wouldn't end up with a ton of bureaucracy behind it, because the worst thing that can happen is that you end up with 500, 600, 1,000, 10,000, 20,000 people whose job is not only dependent on it, but now the structure of that thing is dependent on hiring more people. And that's what we did. So instead of being able to go, well, wait, can we get rid of Homeland Security? Now I can't even say that because it's so ensconced into the bureaucracy. The maintenance of the thing is somehow gaining more power than the power the thing had itself. So it's a really fascinating flip. This is sort of how these things come to be, like as a thing.
Mm. Thank you, Burks.
Brown Bunny says, capitalism is not based in charity. Let's not be naive. U.S. hegemony is about hostility and intimidation, allows a continuation of imperialism, exploitation of the system. I mean, sure, you can feel free to say that all you want. And that's great. Like, what does that mean? Does that mean anything? Do you think that every single person who got into diplomacy, or every person who works for USAID or any of the NGOs that they support, every single one of them's like, yeah, I'm here for America hegemony? No. Is it wielded that way? Sure. The maintenance of the thing, the maintenance of the U.S. and maintaining the U.S. in its position ends up taking over the power of any part that anyone could have in it. The actual power of the thing. People talk about changing systems from inside. They will tell you that this is how this thing goes. People stay very idealistic openly. That's how they talk about it, and they speak about it, and they run with it. Whether or not they're right is not my question or my point. My point is that they're produced in that system. They're produced in capital. And as such, as they get into it, the maintenance of capital is part of the way capital produces. That's baseline. I mean, that's baseline Marx. It's baseline D&G. And it's also how the function of corporations ends up becoming what it is. I mean, look at 2008 financial crisis. The maintenance of the banks was the thing because capitalism just refused to allow banks to fail. Capitalism would have much preferred it. I mean, talk to libertarians. They would have loved to have banks fail because they believe it would end up, yielding better things in the long run. But having bureaucracy and having government tied in with that stuff, it's part of the system. We'll keep moving.
Oh.
We're going to try to get through this last paragraph. We seem to be straying from the main concern of psychoanalysis, yet never have we been so close. For here again, as we have seen previously, it is in the interiority of its movement that capitalism requires and institutes not only a social axiomatic, but an application of this axiomatic to the privatized family. Representation would never be able to ensure its own conversion without this application that furrows deep into it, cleaves it, and forces it back upon itself. Thus, subjective abstract labor, as represented in private property, has, as its correlate, subjective abstract desire as represented in the privatized family. Psychoanalysis undertakes the analysis of this second term as political economy analyzes the first. Psychoanalysis is the technique of application for which political economy is the axiomatic. In a word, psychoanalysis disengages the second pole in the very movement of capitalism, which substitutes the infinite subjective representation for the large determinate objective representations. It is in fact essential that the limit of the decoded flux of desiring production be doubly exercised, doubly displaced, once by the position of immanent limits that capitalism does not cease to reproduce on an ever-expanding scale, and again by the marking out of an interior limit that reduces this social reproduction to restricted familial reproduction. I do want to get through this paragraph for a reason. You'll kind of see, but the last two paragraphs and kind of everything that we've talked about here, it's like, well, wait, what does this have to do with psychoanalysis or psychotherapy or counseling or self-help or any of this stuff where it seemed to be so far from it? They say, but no, we've never been so close. They They sort of are going, yeah, we've digressed, but only insofar as you think. We're actually talking about what's really happening here. For here again, as we've seen previously, it is in the interiority of its movement that capitalism requires and institutes not only a social axiomatic, but an application of this axiomatic to the privatized family. It isn't that capitalism only creates social rules outside of ourselves. That's not what they've been saying. I hope I went over that sufficiently to make that point. They are not talking about this being purely a social phenomenon. No. Instead, specifically, it's actually applied to the family unit. That it is the interiority of the family that is actually where the logic and dynamic of capitalism functions and its axiomatic functions most. Okay, we'll explain why, but when we talk about family, we mean whatever the fuck you want that to mean. It means family in our world. It's not that 50 years ago we had a more nuclear family than we do now. Go look at what family is defined as or how we're setting it up today. Doesn't matter. It's all this. So Ingalls, yeah, you're going to see a lot of those guys in a little bit of these things. Representation would never be able to ensure its own conversion without this application that furrows deep into it, cleaves it, and forces it back upon itself. When we take codes, when we have this reterritorialization happen, when we move to this place of the axiomatic, this transformation of representation in capitalism depends on the application to family life. It depends on us making a move to see mom, dad, me, to see things symbolically, to look at the analogous relationships of everything, to oversimplify and flatten the world. This application of the axiomatic penetrates divides, reshaping representation itself in this form. This is Oedipus, by the way, coming to fruition. They're talking about Oedipus as we know it, but they're talking about representation specifically, bringing this together. Thus, subjective abstract labor, your abstract labor, subjective abstract labor, as represented in private property, has as its correlate subjective abstract desire as represented in the privatized family. Labor, worker going out, there you go. Social, the social space of labor and how it's produced. Desire, subjective abstract desire is represented in the privatized family as its correlate. Okay? Abstracted private property, abstracted in the family structure. Okay, private property, private labor, family, desire. Both become subjective abstractions under capitalism. Psychoanalysis undertakes the analysis of the second term, as political economy analyzes the first. Political economy, political economics, political social theory, blah, 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 is going after specifically abstract labor. That's what Marx was going after, all of that. But psychoanalysis is going after desire. There's these two paths. We'll get into the diversion of them, but the big deal is that these two functions, political economy and the psychoanalytic sort of self-help bullshit, these two things together serve complementary functions in capitalism. Psychoanalysis is the technique of application. Sorry, I need to go to the next page. Going over my notes as we do this. Psychoanalysis is the technique of application for which political economy is the axiomatic. Political economy, okay, establishes the rules. Psychoanalysis applies these rules to the familial space. So this makes psychoanalysis capitalism's tool for managing desire. Okay? Brown Bunny, Whig, our interlocutor, was assisting USA as a necessary... I didn't say necessary charitable force. Are you going to fucking actually listen to what I'm saying? That's terrible. That's terrible. I absolutely... I was not saying, oh, I want USA to stick around because it's a necessary force. No, I just don't like people dying because USA did prevent people from dying. Was it good overall? No, I don't think that we should have it. But that was my point. is the difficulty that comes with maintaining the space. Jesus Christ, these people.
Brooks.
These people, man.
Calm down.
Sorry, it's just
I know.
fucking...
Yeah. Tell this guy, how do you manage a 12 years civil war, right, in Libya, right, with amount of like, and after a genocide in Tawarqa?
You manage it by tweeting and commenting on videos.
Yeah, like this is kind of waste like it's a way. It's waste of his time rather than like kind of like critiquing. Go like read about Libya, people who lived experience that like were surrounded by civil war there, right? I lived that because I live in Libya, by the way. So,
and again, the world is a complicated, nightmarish place filled with a lot of sadness and harm and good and bad things, lots of different shit. Capitalism is doing things. We're not overthrowing capitalism tomorrow. So yeah, it's making kids not die. Yay. Like, I don't understand. Whatever. People are fucking weird.
Brooks, there's immigrants from Sudan. There's a civil war that immigrants that are living now from Sudan to Libya who live there, and we give them aid by the USA, because if we cut the aid out of them, what they gonna do?
Well, we know what they're gonna do. Like, this is the thing, is we know what will happen because we understand the material conditions and pressures behind all of these things. It's kind of wild. But again, I want to keep moving. Sorry if I got distracted. I just, people are fucking wacky, man. All right. I just finished. Psychoanalysis is the technique of application for which political economy is the axiomatic. So we have the axiomatic. We have the social rules that are constructed. Psychoanalysis takes those social rules and puts them in the family, makes us have those relationships with those who we are immediately responsible for, taking care of by, taking care from. And so as such, psychoanalysis is capitalism's tool for managing desire. Psychoanalysis is not just saying, oh, well, I don't go to a psychoanalyst. I go to a psychiatrist. I go to a neurosurgeon. I go to a neurologist. I go to a psychiatric ward. I go to Jordan Peterson. I read 12 steps, and I fucking love Tony Robbins and all this other shit. All that stuff. It's all the same. This is what it's all the same shit. And as they finish, they say, in a word, psychoanalysis disengages the second pole in the very movement of capitalism, which substitutes the infinite subjective representation for the large determinate objective representation. Psychoanalysis ultimately then is handling one of those two poles. The pole is desire, labor, desire. Those are two poles of oscillation. Psychoanalysis is handling, obviously, desire. It participates in the shift from the objective to subjective representation. For example, objective representation is social. My mom. If I were to say, hey, mom's great, who am I talking about? There's the objective to the subjective. It's a very simple, oversimplified version, but it's just take all of that, the symbolic global persons, to the privatized version. Oh, I have a dad. I know what a good man is. Objective, subjective, objective, subjective. Psychoanalysis handles this thing, builds this, the self-repression rules that we experience, all of those things. Like, it's wild when you start really breaking down how the language begins to fuck with us, but it is objective to subjective is sort of the play that they're talking about here, right? I hope that makes sense. Because this last bit is kind of going to be, we'll end on this. This is kind of a bear to get through. It is in fact essential that the limit of the decoded flux of desiring production be doubly exorcised, removed, doubly displaced, once the position of imminent limits that capitalism does not cease to reproduce on an ever-expanding scale, and again, by the marking out of an interior limit that reduces this social reproduction to restricted familial reproduction. Okay. So, capitalism decodes. It decodes. As such, capitalism is sort of, I don't want to say responsible. I don't want to put personification on it, but capitalism must control desire that it has set free. Decoded desire, decoded flux, liberated desire that it has set free. The fact that we are not determined by a king or by a social position, our lives are not set up for us anymore, which a lot of people are sad about, by the way. That thing, it's freedom. But we can't just have people being free, because then stuff won't get made. Bill Hicks has a bit on this, where he says, how many people are going to want to pay for bombs or even build them or take part in them when you realize everyone's your brother and sister? That's kind of what we're talking about. Like, the moment you're liberated, you kind of don't want to take part in a lot of the stuff capitalism kind of needs to function, or the stability of it, or the system, or these archaisms, the stuff that we've got, the baggage of old, that thing. It's kind of and yes, exactly, LJ. And with this sadness, with this frustration, people turn to Jordan Peterson, who just reifies the same thing. So capitalism has a need to control this decoded flux, this liberated desire. And it does this two ways, okay? It does this, one, through constantly expanding external boundaries in society. That sounds weird, but it's always changing what the limits of society are and giving more and more room. It doesn't ever feel like we're trapped, even though we fucking really are, because it's an ever expanding limit that capitalism conditions, which is on the one side. But then also, because you exist in capitalism as kind of this, we'll say you're the nexus, you're the singularity in your own little story. You develop internal boundaries. And those internal boundaries, yours, not mine are my internal boundaries. The internal boundaries, the subject experiences, you experience internal boundaries that are placed there by the family, and then external boundaries that are constantly and ever growing in social space. But those are boundaries. That's still captured. It's still boundaries and conditioned and set up. So this dual control ultimately reduces social issues to family dynamics. How many times have you heard people say, well, look, if I ran my house, my business, if I ran my life the way the government runs their budget, I'd be bankrupt. Yep. Well, what if a bunch of fucking illegals just came into your house? Yep. You and all of us, in some degree, all of us, there's no getting away from this. No one's like free of this shit. No one's free of this shit. But we take this sort of thing, and capitalism puts in us this really weird thing where social issues ultimately become reduced to family dynamics. And this contains desire. Because then it's Trump daddy upsetting people or defending us, or I'm protecting my daughter by protecting all women from the trans menace, or whatever it is. I'm personalizing it, bringing it in, making it my thing. And desire is therefore controlled and contained in this method. Okay? And all of this is how capitalism, and they use the phrase here, and it's important. Exorcised is the phrasing that they use. The desire is exorcised. The decoded flux of desire and production be doubly exorcised, doubly displaced. It can't just be tossed aside. It has to be doubly so. It has to be thrown out through both of these mechanisms. It has to be destroyed through both of these mechanisms. Because desire that's just doing what it's doing, one, wouldn't produce a subject, just as a thing, probably wouldn't produce a subject, not meaningfully, not as we know it. But two, really wouldn't be a good worker and wouldn't be able to, do the thing, go to school for 12 years, go to school for maybe another 4, have a lot of debt, have some credit cards, do the thing you're supposed to do, go work, go produce, go spend. This thing, desire, free desire, again, pre-personal, before it's malformed and all of these things and trapped. if you can turn it into, well, no, I need to learn proper discipline. My father taught me that I needed to wait, that I needed to be smart about it. And, my mom, she really cared for me. She showed me that being warm is really important, and that ultimately I just have to hold off on, the excitement, that I shouldn't have a great time. I mean, if I were to go just blow all my money tomorrow, I'd have a great time, but that's not going to be good for my future. Blah, 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 blah. I'm not saying to go fucking do a bag of Coke with a straw. Like, I'm not saying that. Like, I'm not saying to go do crazy. They're not saying that either. They're not saying go schizo. They're not saying go fucking nuts and go weird. They're saying this is how we're made. This is how we're made. Sorry, it's an old line from a band I worked with, Rehab. Stick a straw in the bag and do it all at one time. Old line. Good band. And that's where we're going to end, I think, today. That's where I think we're going to end today. Because as we move forward, the movement of how these things play is going to touch in really close. And I'm going to be doing a couple streams on it this week. I'm excited. Our friend Jordan Peterson. Because as we move into this chapter, into this section more, allow me to read 2 sentences. And you tell me if you think that I can find a way to relate it to Jordan B. Peterson. Is that like Michael B. Jordan B. Peterson? Consequently, the ambiguity of psychoanalysis in relation to myth or tragedy has the following explanation. I have so much to talk about with our friend Jordan. I have so many things to talk about with Jordan. So that'll be a fun week. And then Friday during the day, I'm going to be doing a daytime sort of open study sort of room. I'm going to try, I'm scheduled it this time. So I'm going to be here. It'll be 2, 3, maybe 4 hours just going over this section or other parts of Anti-Oedipus. If anyone would like to join, it'll be noon-ish, right around the same time. Should be a blast. And I want to thank all of you. For joining. As always, it's the highlight of my week. Please do take a look at my video I posted. I spent a lot of time writing. It's hard to write. I don't even know how I found 50 minutes to get through the entirety of, like a simplified entirety of structural anthropology. I haven't got Grial in there. It's a whole thing. But I highly recommend giving it a watch. I'd like it.
Brooke, can you put those study sessions and live stream into the actual event calendar?
I am. I've scheduled it in my real life. I will be adding it to the event calendar, and I'll make sure that I post it within everyone, so everyone gets that. Thank you, Cryborn, for the super chat.
Last time you did a really long stream on a Friday night, and then I think you split the stream into smaller chunks.
Yes.
And then after that, I think you did some more streams. And the time was kind of confusing because I would love to.
The time is going to be confusing as I kind of figure out the challenge is I'm trying to figure out life to stream, and because I don't want to do 45 minutes because I have to stop. That would be the worst.
Okay. Yeah.
So but Friday during the day is going to be a set time for this. Thank you, Jordan.
Okay. I will
keep an eye on it. I will message you specifically and make sure you check it out. So. But with that, thank you all. I will see you all next week, and we will continue from here if you don't join me Friday. Thank you all.